At about 4:10 in the morning, Adrienne Celeste Salinas starts calling her boyfriend again and again and again.
Just the night before, the group of friends had celebrated a birthday party at Adrienne's apartment. Adrienne and Francisco left the party around 2:30 a.m.
She goes inside, gets a bag, changes her clothes, and tells her friend that she's gonna go back to Francisco's house. At that point, nobody ever sees Adrienne again.
In the next 40 minutes, the outgoing calls pile up into the dozens, the kind of phone log that doesn't read like casual conversation. None of them are answered. At roughly 4:23 a.m., she calls a cab company and asks for a pickup at an AM/PM convenience store at Hardy Drive and University Drive in Tempe. It's a simple plan: meet the cab, ride back to her boyfriend's place, end the night. But when the cab pulls in and the driver looks for her under the gas station's fluorescent lights, Adrienne isn't there. He tries her phone. It doesn't connect. And then, around 5:07 a.m., her cell phone shuts off, her last known signal, leaving investigators with a tight window, a short route, and a silence that has never been convincingly explained. Adrienne was 19 years old, a community college student living near the Arizona State University area in Tempe, in an apartment around the 800 block of West Brown Street. Friends described her as social and close to her family, the kind of daughter who stayed in contact, especially with her father, Rick Salinas, who had plans with her for Father's Day that weekend. What makes this case different isn't just that she went missing, it's the geography. Police would later focus on a narrow corridor, Hardy Drive, between 5th Street and University Drive, a walk so short it's been described, again and again, as roughly a quarter mile. In a college neighborhood near familiar streets, in the hours when bars close and the city is still half awake, Adrienne seemed to vanish inside a distance most people cross without thinking. The night before, Friday, June 14, 2013, slips into early Saturday morning like a typical summer weekend near campus, an apartment gathering, time with friends, and later time spent at her boyfriend's place. Alcohol is referenced in later reporting, but the exact details, how much, how impaired, aren't publicly pinned down in official records. What is clear is that, sometime around 3:00 a.m., her boyfriend later says he drove her back to her apartment rather than having her stay the night. Not long after, one of Adrienne's roommates reportedly saw her again, back at the apartment, and later saw her leave carrying an overnight bag, suggesting she intended to return to her boyfriend's place anyway. That small detail matters because it's a sign of intent. She wasn't disappearing from her life. She was moving through it, making the kind of short, practical decisions people make at the end of a night out. Then something in the night turns mechanical. A call comes into Tempe police reporting a vehicle that has hit a median near Ash Avenue and Rio Salado Parkway. When authorities locate it, they identify the car as Adrienne's. The vehicle is disabled and it has 2 flat tires. In the early hours, that scene is its own kind of message. A trip interrupted, a plan suddenly broken, a driver no longer moving the way she intended. After that, the only confirmed trail is digital and timing-based calls, a cab request, and the disappearance itself. Between approximately 4:10 a.m. and 4:50 a.m., Adrienne repeatedly calls her boyfriend, commonly reported as around 32 calls in that stretch. He does not answer. The content of any texts during this period is not publicly released in quotes. What survives in the public record is the pattern, urgency without response. Then comes the pivot that should have made the night safer. Adrienne doesn't commit to a longer walk. She doesn't try to drive a disabled car. She calls a professional cab and arranges a public pickup point, the AM/PM at Hardy and University. In a college city, that kind of place is a beacon, bright lights, cameras in theory, cars coming and going. A rational choice after an accident, a way to put structure back into a messy night. But structure only works if you reach it. Police later described the critical window as roughly 4:30 a.m. to 4:53 a.m., the period when Adrienne is believed to be on foot, heading toward Hardy Drive, moving between 5th Street and University Drive. There is no publicly released CCTV clip that definitively shows her on that route or arriving at the store. No widely published image of Adrienne in those last minutes. No confirmed witness account placed on the record that pins her to a specific spot in motion. Around the agreed time, the cab driver arrives at the AM/PM. He waits, he looks. Adrienne doesn't appear. He tries to call her. The attempt is unsuccessful, and soon after, according to reports, Adrienne's phone powers off around 5:07 a.m., the last known phone activity tied to her. From an investigative standpoint, it's the kind of timeline that feels almost too clean. A disabled car, a burst of unanswered calls, a cab ordered to a specific location, and then nothing. Tempe police would continue to treat what happened to Adrienne as suspicious and keep the case open. Federal involvement and reward appeals would come later. But in the beginning, the case lived inside minutes and streetlights, inside a short walk that on paper should have ended at a convenience store. And that's the question that still cuts through every retelling. If Adrienne never made it to that AM/PM, what happened to her in the space between her front door and those lights, on a route that's been measured as only a quarter mile? By daylight on June 15, the case had already become a problem of absence more than evidence. There was no confirmed sighting placed publicly on the record after that pre-dawn corridor on Hardy Drive, and there was no verified proof, at least none released, that Adrienne reached the AM/PM, got into any vehicle, or arrived at her boyfriend's apartment. The investigation had to start the way many campus area cases start, by rebuilding an ordinary life in precise, documentable pieces, and then finding the first place that life doesn't line up with the record. Adrienne Celeste Salinas was 19. She lived in Tempe, in an apartment near the 800 block of West Brown Street, close to the Arizona State University area, an environment built around students, roommates, short walks, and weekends that blur into early morning. Public reporting doesn't offer a full childhood timeline. Exact birthplace, earlier schools, or a detailed upbringing are not widely published, but what is consistently described is her life at that moment. A young woman attending community college in the Tempe area, living independently with roommates, balancing school with what some reports describe as a part-time job, though the employer and schedule are not consistently documented across major outlets. Friends and family interviews paint a simple, credible portrait grounded in behavior rather than legend. She was loving, caring, social in the way many 19-year-olds near a campus are social, and close to her family, close enough that a missed contact was not treated as a shrug. Father's Day wasn't just a calendar holiday in this story, it was a routine expectation. Adrienne had plans with her father, Rick Salinas, and when she didn't show up, and when she didn't call, the silence became specific enough to act on. That concern, tied to a real plan and a real pattern, is what moved this from a bad night to an official missing person investigation. Once police were notified, June 15 into June 16, in public reporting, investigators began doing what the public rarely sees in detail because the paperwork stays inside the file, interviewing the people who had the most recent contact with her, checking her likely route, and trying to turn a chaotic night into a stable timeline. Those early interviews centered on three roles that matter in any last hours case: the boyfriend she'd been trying to reach, the roommate who reportedly saw her leaving with an overnight bag, and the cab driver dispatched to the AM/PM who says she never appeared. The boyfriend is often identified in reporting only partially, frequently by a first name, sometimes appearing in compiled timelines with additional labeling. But what matters in the verified narrative is his role, not a headline identity. He was the person Adrienne was trying to get back to, the recipient of the burst of unanswered calls earlier that morning, and one of the last people reported to have seen her. Public coverage also indicates he cooperated with police and was questioned. Law enforcement has not publicly accused him, and some accounts describe him as not considered a suspect after investigative checks. In a case without charges, that boundary matters. Proximity does not equal proof, and nothing in the reliable public record establishes him as responsible. The roommate account, again, reported through media summaries rather than published sworn statements, adds something investigators pay close attention to: intent and direction. The detail of Adrienne leaving with an overnight bag doesn't solve a case, but it tells you she was planning forward, not vanishing backward. She was moving toward a destination that made sense in her normal routine, back to her boyfriend's place after a night that had already gotten complicated. And then there's the cab driver, whose importance isn't emotional, it's logistical. His job is arrival, confirmation, and the gap between "I was dispatched" and "the passenger entered my car." In the public record, he becomes a time-stamped witness. He responds to a request for pickup at Hardy and University, waits, tries to call, and leaves without her. Reports also indicate he was questioned and not treated publicly as a suspect after his account and records were checked. That doesn't answer where Adrienne went, but it does harden the problem. The meeting point didn't produce the meeting. With the last known movement occurring near a college neighborhood, the search strategy reflects what that geography allows. Investigators and search teams looked around Adrienne's apartment area and the surrounding neighborhood. Searches expanded to nearby locations including Tempe Town Lake, and police canvassed for information, neighbors, associates, and anyone who might have been awake and watching in those pre-dawn hours. But public reporting is clear about what was not available to the public. There is no widely released CCTV clip of Adrienne on Hardy Drive, and no definitive surveillance image has been published showing her at the AM/PM or walking into the store. That absence of footage isn't just frustrating, it shapes how the story is told and how the investigation moves. Without a confirmed visual, everything hinges on the chain of corroboration. Phone records summarizing timing, the cab dispatch and arrival, roommate and boyfriend accounts, and the disabled car that appears in the night, like a signpost with no arrow. Police reviewed phone records and call logs, which implies formal legal access and analysis, but the raw underlying data, full call logs, tower information, precise location coordinates, has not been made part of the public record. The audience sees the outline, the investigators work inside the details. And inside those details sits one of the hardest truths for any family. In the earliest stage of a disappearance, you can do everything right and still find nothing you can hold. Adrienne's father did what many parents say they would do but hesitate to do. He trusted his knowledge of his daughter's habits over the hope that she'd turn up. He reported her missing, and the machinery of law enforcement turned on. Interviews, searches, timeline reconstruction, and appeals for information. But the case's defining feature remained untouched. It wasn't a long highway trip, or a cross-state flight, or a sprawling wilderness search. It was a tight neighborhood problem, an alleged quarter-mile route, where the difference between safety and disappearance could be a matter of minutes. And as investigators worked outward from her apartment and that short stretch of Hardy Drive, another question pressed in from the side, quietly but relentlessly, because the record confirms the car was found disabled after striking a median. Yet public reporting does not clearly establish whether Adrienne was still with that car when it happened, or what exactly occurred in the moments between that collision and her decision to walk into the dark. On June 16, 2013, Father's Day, Adrienne's father, Rick Salinas, realized something that couldn't be explained away as sleeping in or a dead battery. Adrienne had plans with him, and she hadn't shown. More importantly, she hadn't made contact at all, which family described as out of character. That was the moment a private worry became an official report, and the Tempe Police Department began treating Adrienne as a missing person. From the start, investigators were working against a kind of disappearance that leaves almost no surface to grab. The case did not present a confirmed witness who could say, on the record, "I saw her here at this time." It did not offer a publicly released surveillance image showing her on Hardy Drive or entering the AM/PM. What it did have was a narrow corridor defined by police, Hardy Drive between 5th Street and University Drive, and a set of fixed points around it. Adrienne's apartment near West Brown Street, the AM/PM at Hardy and University, where the cab was dispatched, and the disabled vehicle found near Ash Avenue and Rio Salado Parkway. In the early phase, the work was procedural and urgent. Police and search teams focused on Adrienne's neighborhood and nearby areas, including Tempe Town Lake. They canvassed, interviewed, and tried to determine whether Adrienne's movement that morning was random, forced, or simply interrupted by circumstance. In a campus area case, the difference matters because it changes what investigators prioritize, whether they're looking for a voluntary departure pattern, an accident corridor, or an abduction window. Public reporting confirms these efforts in broad terms, searching, interviewing the boyfriend, roommates, and cab driver, and following leads. But the specific grids, dates, and internal steps aren't fully disclosed in the public record. What the public narrative does make clear is that the three closest, last hours, witnesses were treated as critical nodes in the timeline rather than as a solved answer. Adrienne's boyfriend, the person she was trying to reach, and the one reported to have driven her back to her apartment earlier in the night, was questioned and described in coverage as cooperative. The roommate who reportedly saw Adrienne return and later leave with an overnight bag offered a detail that helped investigators anchor intent and direction. The cab driver, dispatched to a specific location and time, provided a hard boundary. He arrived, she wasn't there, and he could not reach her. Each of those points narrowed the possibilities while also exposing the same uncomfortable gap. If Adrienne's plan was to meet a cab at a public convenience store, then the most consequential part of the night isn't the ride she didn't take. It's the short distance she was believed to be walking to reach that ride. A quarter mile is short enough that investigators can map it quickly and canvass it thoroughly. It is also short enough that the absence of a confirmed sighting becomes its own kind of evidence. It suggests that whatever happened, happened fast and likely without leaving a clean trail behind. And yet, even in that tight corridor, the known record leaves uncertainties that investigators can't ignore. The disabled car, Adrienne's car, was found abandoned with 2 flat tires after striking a median, but public reporting does not clearly establish whether she was physically present when the incident was first observed or when police first engaged the scene. That matters because it defines the sequence of choices. If she was separated from the car immediately, the case takes one shape. If she left the car on foot after the collision, it takes another. Without a publicly released, time-stamped account tying Adrienne to the car at a specific minute, investigators were left to treat it as a critical event marker, but not a complete explanation. The digital trail provided structure but not answers. Investigators reviewed phone records and used call timing to help reconstruct Adrienne's last known activity window, yet the raw location data, precise tower information or GPS-level points, has not been publicly detailed. The practical effect is that the public is asked to picture a disappearance inside a window, not a pinpoint, a time range, a corridor, a last known signal that goes quiet. In cases like this, public attention often gravitates toward the same basic human impulse, to fill the silence with certainty. That's why speculation about specific individuals can spread quickly online, because the mind wants a name to attach to a gap. But the official situation here is strict. No one has been publicly charged, and law enforcement has not publicly named a suspect. Reports indicate the boyfriend and the cab driver were questioned and not publicly accused. Without charges, the investigative boundary is simple and legally important. Suspicion in the public imagination is not evidence in the record. The reality is that the investigation, from early on, was forced to pursue multiple tracks at once. Investigators had to evaluate whether Adrienne's death, if it was a death, was the result of foul play or an accident, while also accepting that the medical examiner's future ability to define cause and manner was unknown at that stage. They also had to hold 2 difficult ideas simultaneously. The case could involve an unknown third party encountered during that short walk, or it could involve an unpredictable chain of events after a night of drinking and car trouble. Publicly, authorities continued to treat the situation as suspicious, indicating they believed the facts did not align with a simple, explainable disappearance. If you care about cases like Adrienne's, cases where a young woman vanishes within an everyday distance, this is where attention matters most, not in rumor, but in verified timelines, in credible tips, in people who were awake in that corridor and never realized what they saw might matter. Because while the search efforts continued and interviews were conducted, the case remained frozen at the same edge. Adrienne had left her apartment area, she had a planned pickup point, and she never arrived. And then, weeks passed without a public breakthrough, until the desert itself changed the case, not through a confession or an arrest, but through weather. On August 6, 2013, the case shifted from a missing person investigation into something harder and more final. After storm activity in the desert east of Phoenix, skeletal remains were discovered in a desert wash near Apache Junction, about 30 miles from where Adrienne was last believed to be in Tempe. The public record doesn't specify the exact time of day the remains were found or identify who made the discovery in most reporting. What is confirmed is the location and the circumstance. A wash affected by storm-related flooding, a place where debris can move and settle after heavy rain. Within roughly a week, DNA testing confirmed what Adrienne's family had feared since Father's Day. The remains were identified as those of 19-year-old Adrienne Celeste Salinas, missing since June. That confirmation solved one question, whether she was alive, but it created several others with far higher stakes. How did she get there? When did she die? And what happened in the time between the last known signal from her phone and the moment her body entered that wash? For investigators, the recovery location introduced a second geography that didn't naturally connect to the first. Tempe is a college city in the Phoenix metro area. The wash near Apache Junction is desert terrain shaped by drainage, storms, and distance. Public reporting emphasizes that stormwater and flooding could have played a role in moving remains, and that environmental factors at the recovery site complicated interpretation. But no public evidence has been released that explains the mechanics of that 30-mile separation, whether it reflects transport by a person, movement by water, or a combination of both. Then came the medical examiner's ruling, an outcome that can feel, to families, like the door closing halfway instead of opening. The cause of death and the manner of death were classified as undetermined. The condition of the remains and environmental exposure were cited in public summaries as key reasons the medical examiner could not determine how Adrienne died. No detailed toxicology results are publicly disclosed in mainstream coverage, and beyond the DNA identification, there is no public record of foreign DNA findings or trace evidence that points to a specific perpetrator. That undetermined ruling matters in a very specific way. It is not the same as saying nothing happened. It is a statement about limits created by time, weather, and the condition of the remains. It leaves the case balanced between possibilities that can't be proven from the publicly known forensic record: homicide versus misadventure, deliberate concealment versus environmental movement, and a fatal event occurring close to her last known area versus far from it. Publicly, law enforcement continued to treat Adrienne's death as suspicious and investigated it as a homicide. In later appeals and anniversary segments, the case was characterized as a murder investigation, with continued requests for information and the involvement of agencies beyond the local level. Community tip programs, such as Silent Witness, continued to list Adrienne's case and publicize rewards. The FBI was also associated with reward and appeal efforts in later reporting, signaling that federal resources were engaged in trying to move an unsolved case forward. This is the point where the investigation becomes a different kind of machine. Instead of searching for a missing person on foot and by air, the focus turns to records, timelines, and gaps that can be tested. Who was where, what was known, what can be verified, and what can't. Investigators worked to understand Adrienne's last hours, using phone records that showed a concentrated burst of calls to her boyfriend and the call to arrange the cab pickup. They revisited the last known corridor on Hardy Drive. They considered the possibility of surveillance in the area, even though no decisive footage has been released publicly. They reviewed statements again, and they continued to ask the public for information, especially anyone who might have been awake, driving, or watching around Hardy Drive in that pre-dawn window. Because the corridor is the uncomfortable centerpiece, police stated she disappeared while walking on Hardy Drive between 5th Street and University Drive. That means the case's central event, the moment Adrienne's path breaks, sits in a place that is not remote, not wilderness, and not far from where people live. The distance between her apartment area and the AM/PM is small enough to be described, repeatedly, as a quarter mile. In investigative terms, that means one of two things is likely. Either there was an encounter that removed her from that route quickly, or the route itself is not fully understood in the public record. The limits of publicly released data matter here. There is no full police case file available to the public, which means the public cannot see detailed interviews, internal suspect analysis, or precise digital location data. The cab company's full logs have not been released publicly, nor has complete phone location information. Without those records, the public is left with a tight series of reference points: cab call time, cab arrival, phone shutoff, recovery location, and the space between them. As the case moved into the years after 2013, media revisits kept bringing the same question back to the surface, often framed around that short distance. What happened in the quarter mile? Documentary programs and investigative features reconstructed the timeline using interviews and reporting, while acknowledging the same unresolved status. By June 2017, a 4-year anniversary report stated that Adrienne's case remained unsolved, with the lead detective, Alan Akey of Tempe Police, speaking publicly about the difficulty and ongoing effort. And that's the investigative cliff edge. By mid-2013, authorities had an abandoned car with 2 flat tires, a dense burst of early morning phone calls, a cab dispatched to a specific meeting point, and a phone that shut off around 5:07 a.m. By August, they had Adrienne's remains, found far away after storms, yet the medical examiner could not determine how she died, and no suspect was publicly named. Which is why the next phase of this story doesn't hinge on a single dramatic piece of evidence. It hinges on what investigators did with the narrow window, the missing records, and the contradictions the public can see, especially the one that refuses to shrink. A young woman vanishes inside a quarter-mile walk, and weeks later, she is found 30 miles away. In September 2015, a national cold case spotlight feature laid out the same hard edge the investigation had been living with since the beginning: a night that ended in a planned cab pickup, followed by a disappearance inside a narrow time window and a phone that went silent. It was the kind of coverage that doesn't create evidence, but it does something law enforcement quietly relies on in stalled cases. It widens the audience beyond the neighborhood. It reaches the person who never thought their memory mattered, the driver who noticed something strange and dismissed it, the bystander who carried a detail for years because no one ever asked the right way. That same dynamic repeated in later years through local investigative work and true crime programming. A People magazine investigates episode titled "Darkness in the Desert" revisited Adrienne's case using interviews and police record-based reconstruction, while a local docuseries framed the mystery around the short route that has defined this case in the public imagination: the quarter mile between Adrienne's apartment area and the AM/PM where she was supposed to meet the cab. Those programs didn't announce a suspect or a resolution. What they did, again, was reopen the question in public and reactivate the hope that time hadn't erased what someone saw. By the 4-year mark, in June 2017, Tempe Police Detective Alan Akey spoke publicly about the investigation's difficulty and the fact that the case was still unsolved. In the years that followed, official and semi-official partners continued to do something that only happens when law enforcement still believes answers are out there. They kept pushing rewards and appeals. Silent Witness, an established tip and reward program in the Phoenix area, continued to list Adrienne's case as unsolved, and later coverage also referenced FBI involvement in reward and outreach efforts, a sign that the case was treated not as a closed file, but as an open question worth federal attention. And yet the legal reality has remained unchanged. No one has been publicly charged in connection with Adrienne Salinas' disappearance or death. There has been no trial, no plea, no verdict, no sentence, because there is no named defendant. That absence isn't just a procedural detail. It tells you something about what the investigation has and what it cannot publicly prove. The known pillars are compelling, but the gap between them has resisted being bridged in a way that meets the standard required to accuse, arrest, and convict. Publicly, the evidence that anchors the case can be summarized in a single breath: a disabled car, a planned cab pickup she never reached, last known phone activity, and remains recovered far from the last known corridor, followed by an undetermined cause and manner of death. Everything else, The precise sequence of events after she stepped into that pre-dawn stretch of Hardy Drive, the manner in which she left the area, the timing of death, the route to the desert wash, sits behind missing records, undisclosed investigative details, and the limits imposed by time and environment. Those limits aren't vague, they're specific, and they shape what can be solved. First, the medical examiner's classification, undetermined cause and undetermined manner, removed a powerful tool investigators often have in homicide work, a medically supported narrative of how death occurred. That doesn't erase suspicion, and it does not prevent an investigation from treating a death as a homicide, but it can make it far harder to move from "something happened" to "this is what happened," especially in court. Second, the most important records in the public timeline are summaries rather than full releases. Phone records were analyzed, but the public does not have complete phone location data. The cab call is known, but the full cab system logs are not part of the public record. The corridor is identified, but no definitive, publicly released surveillance clip places Adrienne step by step on that route. When those elements remain outside public view, the case becomes unusually vulnerable to noise, people trying to fill missing spaces with guesses, and online discussions pulling attention toward individuals without any public evidentiary basis. Third, the recovery location complicates everything. Remains were found in a desert wash after storms, and public reporting notes the role flooding could have played in moving debris. But the distance, roughly 30 miles, also creates the possibility of transport by a person, which law enforcement has never ruled out publicly. The public, meanwhile, is left with two competing interpretations that cannot be resolved from the published record alone: misadventure and environmental movement versus foul play and deliberate disposal. Authorities have continued to treat the death as suspicious and investigate it as a homicide, while acknowledging, implicitly through the lack of charges, that the decisive proof has not emerged publicly. So what is still missing, in strictly verifiable terms? A confirmed, publicly documented sighting of Adrienne on Hardy Drive in those critical minutes. A released record that clarifies her exact movements after the car incident. A witness statement that places a specific vehicle, person, or interaction into that window with credibility strong enough to withstand scrutiny. Or forensic and digital evidence tying a specific individual to the disappearance and to how her body reached that wash. That last point is what makes stalled cases suddenly move after years. Not a dramatic new theory, but one clean fact. A name attached to a time and place, a memory matched to a record, a tip that finally aligns with what investigators already know privately. Adrienne was a 19-year-old student living a recognizably ordinary life near campus. Roommates, parties, a relationship, plans with her father. The horror of this case is how small the break is between normal and gone. If someone saw Adrienne on that route, or saw a vehicle stop where it shouldn't have, or remembers a detail from that morning they never reported because it felt too minor, that detail may be the only thing capable of closing the distance between what's known and what's provable. If you have information about Adrienne Celeste Salinas' disappearance on June 15, 2013, especially anything connected to Hardy Drive between 5th Street and University Drive, the AM/PM at Hardy and University, or how she could have ended up near Apache Junction, report it to Tempe police or through official tip programs associated with the case, including silent witness and FBI-linked reward appeals. One credible detail can be enough to reopen a door that has stayed shut for more than a decade.